people are joining us. So good afternoon and welcome to the 5th annual Hispanic American Heritage Month celebration at UC Berkeley Library. I am your host. My name is Dr. Liladhar Pense, and I am the librarian for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at UC Berkeley. There are few words about the logistics, but before we start any webinar, it is my duty to read land acknowledgement. The UC Berkeley Library recognizes that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the original landscape of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This region continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible university's relationship to Native peoples. As members of the Berkeley Library community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but we also recognize the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. I wanted to give a brief notes about logistics. I will be introducing our speakers, and each speaker will present. Please reserve your questions until the end of the webinar and type them in your question and answer. We will not answer anonymous questions because, we are in a public setting and the questions have to be answered as openly as we can, and we will answer them as they are received. One of our participants and presenters was having difficulty signing in, so we are starting without them. But as soon as if they are able to join us, then I will be more than glad to introduce them and we will take it from there. Today is September 16th, which is a very important date in the history of Latin America, because in 1820, I remember the Grito de Dolores was given by Padre Miguel Hidalgo. Dolores is a town in Guanajuato, Mexico, and the armed resistance to the Spanish colonialism began in case of Mexico. Having said that, this is also a date when Mayflower sets from England or United Kingdom towards America. So keep those two dates in mind. Those are emblematic dates. And I'm not answering here Jeopardy's questions, but I just want to situate our webinar in this context. So our first speaker is Dr. Janaina Campos Lobo. He's a professor at the Institute of Humanities at the University of International Integration of Afro-Brazilian Lusophony, UNILAB, a public university in northeastern Brazil that promotes international collaboration through agreements with Portuguese-speaking countries, as well as other nations in the global south. She earned a PhD and a master's degree in social anthropology from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, UFRGS, in Brazil. In 2022, she was a visiting researcher in the politics department at the New School of Social Research, NSSR, in New York. She is also affiliated with the Center for Anthropology and Citizenship in Brazil. From 2012 to 2017, she worked as an analyst and researcher in the agrarian reform and development at INCRA Brazil, a federal government agency where she focused on initiatives supporting Black communities. Her research focuses on Afro-descendant communities in Latin America, particularly in Ecuador and Brazil, employing ethnographic methods to examine development and ancestral territoriality. Her current research project, investigates climate change from the perspective of the Afro-descendant communities, emphasizing their deep connections to their environment through climate ethnography, which highlights the territorial bonds and relationships that extend beyond human interactions. And currently, 2024-25, she is Lehman Visiting Scholar, David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, Alari Visiting Fellow at Harvard University. Janaina, the floor is yours. And the presentation can be in Spanglish or in portuñol, whatever makes you happy, okay? So let's
English
go with that.
Happy.
Let's go with that.
Thank you so much. Could you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, amazing. Well, at least for me, it's good evening. I am in Brazil. So good evening, everyone. I'm truly delighted to be here tonight, speaking about climate change and Black communities across Latin America. Taking Brazil as an example is not just about imagining possible futures. It is about confronting exclusionary political agendas. It is an act of resistance, first of all. But more than resistance, it is about agency in the world. It is about raising our voice, even in context of control and suppression. So I cannot fully express my gratitude to Berkeley Library and especially to Lila Dar for this opportunity to be here tonight, at least in Brazil, alongside professors Nodia Mena and Antonia Marshall. So thank you so much. I know I have something around 15 and 20 minutes. So I will try to follow this time frame. Well, what I would like to share with you are some reflections on what I call the challenge of the Anthropocene. I will explain why I use this concept and how ethnography and anthropology more broadly can help us to better understand these challenges. So I organize my talk into three main parts. First, briefly, I will discuss how anthropology contributes to the study of climate change and introduce some key concepts to help us analyze it. Second, I will examine how climate change and environmental racism impact traditional and ancestral communities. And finally, I will bring the example, I have to change, yep. I will bring the example of Black communities in Porto Alegre, Brazil, who faced devastating consequence after one of the largest floods in southern Brazil in May last year, 2024. So just to begin, climate change is one of the greatest and most complex challenges of our time. It affects regions and populations in profoundly unequal ways. Many scholars believe that we will remain the defined environmental issue of the 21st century. The climate is shifting in unpredictable directions, and industrial development has inflicted far more damage on life on Earth than anyone could have imagined a century ago. Anthropologists remind us that to truly understand climate change, we must move beyond a focus solely on human actions. We need to consider what some call more than human worlds, the relationships between humans, animals, rivers, forests, and all other beings that co-shape our environment. Learning from local communities with their deep and long-standing connections to nature is essential for navigating this crisis. It is also important to emphasize that there's no single explanation of how we arrived at this crisis, I mean, climate change. And there's no single we that experience in the same way. Climate change does not impact everyone equally. This is the most important thing. Those who contributed least to the problem are often those who suffer its consequence the most. This is why the perspective of historian Dipesh Chakrabarty is so relevant. He reminds us that human values and perspectives are diverse and that we cannot separate the environmental crisis from questions of justice, history, and culture. To truly understand climate change, we need to recognize not only the difference in human experience, but also the deep connections between humans and the non-human world. In my own research, I take an ethnographic approach to the study of climate change. Instead of focusing exclusively on climate models and scientific data, I look at how Black communities in Latin America, and specifically in this presentation, I will give some examples from Brazil. How these Black communities understand and respond to environmental transformations. These communities, I have to say, hold profound knowledge of their territories. For generations, they have developed strategies to adapt and resist environmental challenges. It is no coincidence that despite centuries of dispossession and marginalization, particularly through models of economic development that excluded them, these communities remain here, alive, creative, and thriving. At my university in Brazil, Unilab, we embrace this perspective. Together with colleagues and partners, we are expanding this research to include Angola and Namibia, one of the regions most severely impacted of water scarcity, strengthening connections between Latin America and Africa. In doing so, we are building bridges of knowledge across the global south. So let's start what I'm calling Anthropocene. The concept, briefly, I would just talk briefly about the concept because I really wanna bring the example of Brazil and how Black communities suffered a lot after the floods. The concept of Anthropocene, introduced by Crutzen and Stomer in 2000s, highlights the profound ways in which humans have reshaped the planet's geology and ecosystems, especially since the 18th century. While the term has limitation, it offers a critical lens for rethinking the relationship between humans and the natural world. In anthropology, debates about the Anthropocene are closely tied to what is known as the ontological turn. This perspective pushes to question the very categories of nature and humanity. As anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli reminds us, this intellectual shift is not only a response to the ecological crisis, it is also a symptom of it. From here, the discussion opens into cosmopolitics, a concept developed by philosopher of science Isabelle Stengers, and she argues that Western scientific knowledge should not be privileged as the only valid way of understanding the world. Instead, other knowledge systems, such as those of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, must be valued as equally legitimate. For Stengers, for example, any project oriented toward the common good cannot be built on the unilateral expansion of Western values as a universal framework of governance. Like Stengers, sociologist Bruno Latour also calls for giving voice and visibility to those who have historically been excluded from cycles of representation. Both suggest that what we call science must learn to coexist with other worlds rooted in different metaphysical traditions and practices. This is not simply a matter of cultural relativism. It is an argument for ontological pluralism, the recognition that there are multiple ways of existing, knowing, and engaging with the world. For us as anthropologists, the central question becomes, how can we create a more open and inclusive world where different forms of knowledge collaborate to confront global challenges like climate change? Although research on Afro-Latin American communities has expanded in recent decades, maybe years, discussions about climate change have too often overlooked the contributions of Black communities. More than that, climate policies frequently rely on a single dominant way of knowing, ignoring other knowledge systems. It is crucial to recognize the environmental knowledge of Black communities and their deep, long-standing connections to the land. Recognizing that the world is always changing and that many beings, not only humans, share this space, allow us to see how these communities navigate environmental transformations. It also challenges dominant narratives that have historically excluded Black and Indigenous ways of knowing. So, after this brief introduction to climate change and the new role of anthropology to deal with this issue, which no longer centers exclusively on the human, I want to raise a key question. Does climate change affect everyone equally? And connect to that, how should we think about environmental racism and climate justice? This leads us to another urgent question. How do political models intensify environmental racism? More specifically, how do exclusionary policies contribute to the marginalization or even erasure of those who are made invisible in dominant discussions of the Anthropocene? The American anthropologist Nancy Shepherd Hughes, in her work of Hurricane Katrina, which is pretty famous, spoke about the vulnerability of the poor. It's a concept. She showed that the disproportionate impact of disasters on low-income communities is not simply the result of geographic or climate events. It is also about political neglect, systemic racism, and deeply entrenched poverty. So we return again to the question, does climate change affect everyone equally? Disasters are not simply random events, even if climate science often presents them as unpredictable. Their devastating effects are deeply tied to historical inequalities that have shaped both institutions and social structures. And these structures continue to ensure that certain populations, especially Black and Indigenous communities, face far greater obstacles when it comes to preparing for, surviving, and recovering for climate disasters. We saw this very clearly in Porto Alegre, where the maps is, I'm sharing the map just to, it's right in the south of Brazil. So we saw this very clearly in Porto Alegre after one of the worst floods in the region's history in May 2024. Black communities, particularly those living in low-lying and historically neglected neighborhoods, were among the most severely affected. Their vulnerability was not only geographical, it was the result of decades of exclusion from urban planning, infrastructure investment, and access to public service. So, what happened in Porto Alegre last year? More than like dozens of people lost their lives. Dozens went missing, and hundreds of thousands were displaced from their homes. Whole neighborhoods were flooded, roads and bridges collapsed, and electricity, water, and transport systems were severely disrupted. Vulnerable communities, especially low-income, Black, and Indigenous groups, were among the hardest hit, as they often live in areas with poor infrastructure and limited protection against floods. Scientists have confirmed that climate change made this disaster about twice as likely, while aging, flood defenses, and poor urban planning worsened the impacts. As I mentioned earlier, the flooding affected the entire city of Porto Alegre, but it disproportionately impacted Quilombola communities, Afro-Brazilian groups descendant from enslaved people who often live in environmentally vulnerable areas and face a long history of neglect in infrastructure, health services, and disaster preparedness. Historically, these communities were pushed to the outskirts of the city due to repeated process of gentrification. These floods exposed profound environmental and racial injustice. Many Quilombola families lost their homes, crops, and source of livelihood, with very limited access to emergency aid or state support. The disaster underscored not only the urgent need for climate adaptation policies, but also the imperative to confront systemic inequalities that put marginalized communities at the greatest risk. In Brazil, there are numerous laws and legal mechanisms designed to protect Afro-descendant communities and promote racial equality. For instance, the federal constitution, the Quilombo Lands Rights Law from 2000s. But these legal frameworks aim to protect Afro-descendant communities from historical and structural inequalities, ensuring access to education, land, and cultural recognition. Yet, despite this protection, implementation remains a challenge, and the most vulnerable communities are still disproportionately affected by social and environmental crises. But what actually happened was that after the floods, this community, sorry, I will come back. But what actually happened was that after the floods, these communities were left largely to fend for themselves. Despite the numerous laws and public policies, as you can see in the screen, designed to protect Afro-Brazilian communities, aid barely reached them. Day after day, what we witnessed were the communities themselves creating networks of support, finding ways to shelter children and the elderly to prevent further harm and to rebuild their lives. In the face of systemic neglect, they had to rely on their own resilience and solidarity to recover. Recognizing the knowledge, resilience, and rights of Quilombola communities, Afro-descendant communities, is essential in any comprehensive response to climate crisis in Brazil. Their inclusion in climate governance, land security, and recovery planning is a matter of justice and sustainability. So I brought, as you can see, I did some interviews, and for me, this sentence is pretty strong. Nobody listened to us, and we received no help. During 2023 draw, with severely affected Quilombola communities, no assistance reached us. And even now, in the aftermath of the floods, the situation remains the same. again, some photos of the disaster. And I will try, there's another sentence that I want to highlight. We are making this effort to support each other as brothers and family. It's about coming together as a community. It's us, for us, with us, because it's difficult to receive anything from agencies. I wouldn't even say competent ones, but rather incompetent ones, he argues. According to Jamaica, the majority of the donations coming in are guaranteed by collectives and social movements, the Black movements, unions, and other quilombos, such as Familia Silva, and initiatives that come through social networks. Cars are constantly arriving, delivering blankets, drinking water, meals, food, medicine, tarps, raincoats, and more. And I'm not sure if I will be able to, but I will try.
Pessoal, Jamaica, quilombo do Mercado, aí, quinto quilombo urbano de Porto Alegre. Fica na Zona Norte, no bairro Sarandi. A cidade aqui é grande, mais de 7.000 famílias perderam tudo. O quilombo, 40% do quilombo perdeu bastante coisa, e a gente precisa de muitas coisas. Colchão, cobertor, lençol, fronha, travesseiro, cesto básico, higiene, limpeza, tipo, o que vocês tivessem, puder mandar para o quilombo assim, mande para nós, por favor, que é urgência, é vidas. Pessoal, Jamaica.
So, their experience is just one of many that reveal how environmental crises interact with racial and social inequalities. If we look at the history of Porto Alegre, we can see that Black communities were pushed into the most vulnerable areas of the city as a part of a process of gentrification, as I said, and the exclusion of the Black population. But disasters like this are not natural. Climate change made the rains more intense, and social inequalities determined who suffered the most. Low-income, Black and Indigenous communities already living with poor infrastructure and limited protection were hit the hardest. This tragedy reminds us that climate change is never neutral. It deepens existing inequalities and exposes who is considered expendable in our societies. So thank you so much. I hope, I think I respected the time. And again, thank you so much, Liladar, for the invitation. Thank you, Nadia and Antonia, for sharing this with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janaina. It was good to hear the perspectives that you brought forth with respect to Quilombolas. There were some questions, so I have asked them to wait until the end of the webinar so everybody can address them in a holistic, cohesive manner rather than dwelling upon individual identity politics questions. Having said that, I will now invite Dr. Nadia Mena to speak, but I will, of course, introduce our speaker to our audience. And we will take it from there. So 1 second, I'm learning as I go, and sometimes things take time. So here you go. Dr. Nadia C. Mena, ella, is a Spanish lecturer at Guilford College. Her research interests lie at the intersection of race and ethnicity, languages, cultures, Afro-Indigenous immigrant heritage reclamation, ancestral knowledge system with education, and community making as within education. Dr. Mena grew up with a strong awareness of her Garifuna heritage, which blends African and native Carib influences shaped by colonization and Marronage. As a visionary educator, she explores Afro-Indigenous cultural traditions and artistic practices. Her academic work is deeply informed by her experiences as an Afro-Latina and Honduran immigrant of Garifuna descent, Nadia centers on social equity through community engaged research with Garifuna women, education advocacy, and critical research methodology, primarily focusing on racial and gender justice. As a lecturer at Guilford College, she applies her research to address educational disparities and promote more inclusive policies. Her research in education leadership and cultural foundations inform efforts to create more equitable learning environments. So, bienvenida, doctora, y puedes hablar en español o en inglés, como sea, ¿no? Aquí estamos para escucharle.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, and thank you once again for your invitation, Lida Har. I am Nodia Mena, Dr. Nodia Mena, and my pronouns are she, her, ella. I am an educator, and I am also an older sister. So as an older sister, I have been educating all my life. I am an able-bodied. My profession is educator, leader of learning. My hobbies are cooking. You know, I always have some friends over because I always love to cook. So that's part of who I am. I know Lida Har already went through the land acknowledgement. I live in the state of North Carolina, and for me, it is essential to acknowledge those who came before me. And I honor the indigenous people in my state of North Carolina. I am in the space located on the traditional lands of the Keyawi, Catawba, Innu, Saponi, Shakori, and Saura nations, and that this technology leaves a significant footprint and contributes to changing climates that disproportionately affect indigenous people and people of color. Just as important, Black history is important to know as well. Acknowledging the land is just as important as acknowledging Black history by highlighting liberatory movements such as the Black Panther Power and the Civil Rights Movement created to counter systemic oppressions. These liberatory movements inspire various groups to form their own emancipation movements in the pursuit of a more just society. For example, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Larry Itliong co-founded the United Farm Workers Movement to advocate for the rights of and better conditions for farm workers. This was also a civil rights movement. Thus, we see not only inspiration, but also a history of collaboration between Black and Brown communities in the United States. Black and Brown coalitions that have gained national and international attention, resulting in policy change, are integral to the history of the United States. In Latin America and the Caribbean, however, histories of Black and Brown coalitions and struggles are often not disseminated through formal educational settings. I learned through my community members about the history of the transatlantic slave trade, for example. And this map represents the slave trade, for example. And I learned that 12 million out of 12 million approximate Africans who were forcibly brought to the Americas, 95% disembarked in Latin America and the Caribbean, and only 5% disembarked in the United States. Sometimes when I am in conversations with my students and I present this information, they are surprised about it because this is not information that is disseminated as in informal spaces of education. So many of the enslaved Africans that are the British, the Portuguese, the French, the Spaniards, colonizers brought to the Americas escaped the system of slavery and formed coalitions with indigenous tribes. Some of them, the Taínos and the Arawak, whose ancestors had inhabited Latin America for over 14,000 years. The established communities with the natives in Latin America and the Caribbean regions, and essentially learn essential survival skills. Through these conditions, though these coalitions, the Africans adopted a common Amerindian language and became powerful allies in the wars against their oppressors. These newer communities reimagined themselves as Afro-Indigenous with their own identities, acknowledging in that manner their African ancestry as well as their Amerindian background. This reimagination gave way to maroon communities, such as Quilombos and Macambos in Brazil, Palenques in Colombia, Cuba, and Ecuador, Cimarrones in Uruguay, Cuba, and several parts of the Spanish America. Then the Cumpes in Venezuela, and Garífunas, Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, among others. Garifuna people's history mirrors the many histories of colonial settlers who violently enslaved and displaced native people from their homelands. Colonial violence and displacements are intimately related to a ubiquitous division of humanity in the Americas, where humans are categorized to be tracked and governed under the normalcy of liberty and supremacy based on race, geography, nation, and other social differences. A prominent colonial division of humanity is racial ethnic categorization, among which we have Hispanic, the reason for which we are here today, commemorating Hispanic Heritage Month. So when I look at the different renditions of Hispanic Heritage Month commemoration, Hispanic is represented one-dimensionally. But this particular commemoration, right, was generated precisely to celebrate language, right? There are about 40 million Latinos who speak Spanish at home in the United States. Family history and heritage is another reason for which to commemorate Hispanic Heritage Month. About 65 million people in the United States identify as Hispanic. We also commemorate Hispanic Heritage Month to remember collective resistance, right? It's during this time where Latin American countries commemorate their independence. Now, just a second. So the way in which this celebration, right, we see is one-dimensionally, and it's mainly a representation mostly proximal to European descendants. And not only their skin tone, but also markers of perceived resemblance to the dominant culture. So who is Hispanic, right? And as per the Pew Hispanic Center, right, in 1976, the US Congress passed the only law in this country's history that mandated the collection and analysis of data for a specific ethnic group, Americans of Spanish origin and descent. The language of that legislation described this group as Americans who identified themselves as being of Spanish-speaking background and traced their origins to being a descendant of Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Central and South America, and other Spanish-speaking countries. Standards for collecting data on Hispanic were developed by the Office of Management and Management Budget in 1977 and revised in 1997. Using these standards, schools, public health facilities, and other government entities and agencies keep track of how many Hispanics they were serving, right, in their area. That was the primary goal of the 1976 law. In the eye of the Census Bureau, Hispanics can be of any race, in any ancestry, right? And it could be from any country of origin. Just a moment, I'm having some issues here. They could be from any country of origin. And the result is that there are various patterns relating to where people come from and how they choose to identify themselves on the census. For example, some 99% of immigrants from Mexico call themselves Hispanic, but just 87% of immigrants from Venezuela, or 89% from Venezuela, identify as Hispanic. And 70% of immigrants from Spain and only 67% of immigrants for Panama. As far as race is concerned, 54% self-identify as white, 1.5% identify as Black, 40% do not identify with any race, and 3.8% identify as being two or more races. I was intrigued by the number 1.5%, right? 1.5% of Hispanics self-identify as Black. Because as per the World Bank, 1 in 4 Latin American identify as people of African descent. And for many of them, Spanish is their first language. So Afro descendants in Latin America are one of the largest, yet least visible minorities in the region, comprising over 133 million people, the majority of whom live in Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, Mexico, and Venezuela. So this low percentage of African descendants who identify as Hispanic, and this inspired me to understand the social stratification system of the colonial period. This is an excerpt I wanted to share with you because Afro-Latino identity is distinct from and can exist alongside a person's Hispanic identity. Afro-Latinos' life experiences are shaped by race, skin tone, and other factors in ways that differ from other Hispanics. While most Afro-Latinos identify as Hispanic or Latino, not all do, according to our estimate based on survey U.S. adults conducted in 2019 and 2020. And this is information that I'm going to leave here for you, but this is from the Pew Research Center. Then this is the pyramid. This one here shows how in Latin America, the Spaniards and their descendants strategically occupied the highest positions. They designed a stratification system to hold and control political power, social and economic power, at the cost of impoverishing indigenous and Africans. My Garifuna community, for example, represents a fusion of Black and Amerindian culture and traditions. They originated on the island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They were delegitimized by the British, expelled from the island of St. Vincent and sent to Honduras, a territory that was occupied by the Spaniards. The Garifuna people arrived on the island of Roatán in Honduras on April 12, 1797. They were forced to learn Spanish, a new language, because our ancestors' language is the Garifuna language. They were forced to adapt to a new environment. They were forced to navigate a colonial system that excluded their ways of being in the world and to grapple with complex layers of identity formation. So, in the spirit of commemorating Hispanic Heritage Month, it is vital to understand how the Garifuna people navigated the Spanish colonial system in Central America. During this period, the neoliberal colonial practices in the region impacted the social and cultural positioning of the Garifuna community as Black indigenous people in exile. The Garifuna people dispersed throughout Central America, settling in Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. As they expanded, they established villages in various locations and primarily relied on wage work due to the limited employment opportunities. The United Nations Human Rights of the High Commissioner estimate that approximately 300,000 Garifuna people reside in Honduras, while the Council of the Hemispheric Affairs report around 5,100 live in Guatemala and close to 20,000 live in Belize. After 228 years in this region, the Garifuna continue to confront colonialism, especially the enduring consequences of centuries of European domination through exclusionary practices and a governmental system that intentionally distances itself from Blackness. Understanding Blackness in Central America, particularly in my country of origin, Honduras, is highly complex. The state has systematically excluded the Garifuna people's knowledge and histories, resulting in issues of invisibility and identity erasure that have historically hinder the Garifuna's socioeconomic progress. Two contributing factors to the complicated understanding of Blackness in Latin America are the Spanish casta system. This and the other one is the images as agents of socialization. So the casta system is the Spanish casta system, is a social racial hierarchy in fact and in law. White or Spaniard was practically coexisting with gente de casta limpia, a category which included not only persons of pure Spanish origin, but mestizos and castizos who were of legitimate descent, free from the taint of Negro blood, and who lived like Spaniards. The Negro pigmentation and features were regarded as repellent. Early colonial officials and chroniclers regarded Negroes and mulattoes as traitors, lazy, bandidos. They were people most immoral in the world. Another contributing factor is the images. I grew up, believe it or not, I grew up in households where I will see these images. In every household I visited, I will see these images. So there were agents of socialization to help us believe something, right? What was that something? So the images indirectly operate as agents by implicitly cultivating an understanding of Blackness. These and many other photos represented how Blackness was socially undesirable. Such understandings shape racial imaginaries regarding ways of interacting with Garifuna people in Honduras and in Latin America. Essentially, these images reinforce ideologies of European superiority and conveyed notions that the norms, values, and language of the dominant culture were universal. These convictions significantly influenced negative perception of the Garifuna people, which led to internalized subordination and normalized a sense of exclusion from the region's decision-making processes. Experiencing an environment where everyone Black was ostracized generated a split sense of identity. Many Garifuna from my generation engaged in code switching, right? Ways of being, ways of knowing to align with social expectation in formal education settings. Using the Garifuna language or learning about the Garifuna history, for example, was not part of our daily experiences in school. It was in our community spaces where we had the opportunity to express our full humanity. I discussed these experiences on my TED Talk, plug, and specifically the exclusion of Garifuna history from the country's history that we were taught in school. The lack of representation, how we were excluded from the decision-making processes in the country made me question my racial identity and the value of my cultural lineage. I needed to unlearn previously internalized subordination. This learning process included reimagining and reshaping the messages that had conditioned my mind to believe that who I was as a Garifuna did not hold any value. Through my research journey, I realized that the research methods utilized by earlier investigators of indigenous peoples were guided by the positivist paradigms, analyzing hypotheses through mere observations, and those hypotheses, however, had been conceived through a certain the generic inferiority of non-white groups of people to justify social inequalities. I chose a constructivist paradigm as the most appropriate to understand the experiences of Black indigenous peoples in Spanish-speaking regions, specifically the Afro-Indigenous Garifuna people of Honduras. I wanted my work to represent authenticity, but I was unsure what that meant and whose knowledge was deserving of representation. Then, during a class with Dr. Harrington, the class name was Black Women Liberatory Praxis. She invited us to create conceptual frameworks that reflected our authentic selves, who we were, and how we experience our identities in the world. Without any hesitation, I thought about a Mainahani because of how this ancestral tradition represented resistance, community making, and cultural continuity through intentional intergenerational knowledge transmission from Garifuna women. Amenahani, or ereba making, is the process of making cassave, ereba, a food product made from yuca or cassava. It was a primary food offering to Garifuna ancestors during ceremonies. The ancestral practice of añahani, or ereba making, is an indigenous way of knowing that Afro-Indigenous Garifuna women learned from the Arawak back on the island of St. Vincent. These women have transmitted this way of knowing intergenerationally. Through my work, I sought to engage in knowledge production techniques that represent a multiplicity of knowledge systems. I utilized the ancestral knowledge system, AKS, as one of the conceptual framework. This was created by Sandoval, Lagunas, Montelongo Diaz in 2016. These scholars collectively call for the study of ancestral knowledge as a new pattern in research methodologies, as a way of deconstructing patterns in research and to deconstruct the dominant Western Eurocentric universalities. This process of decolonization could be a path to the liberation of colonized groups from imposed methods of inquiry. Framing my analysis in this manner allowed me to create the conditions through which I explore the nuances of the stories of my elders. It also allowed me to understand the colonial practices that have affected their lives while affording me the skills to present the research data meaningfully. I brought Anyahani as a knowledge system that has helped sustain Garifuna culture, language, knowledge system, collective memory, community making, and cultural continuity. As we commemorate Hispanic Heritage Month, we must reconsider the homogeneous nature of its origin and contemplate the need of a more nuanced understanding of the heterogeneity within Spanish-speaking communities. As the census data has shown, not everyone who speaks Spanish identifies as Hispanic. At the same time, Hispanic is not synonymous with a homogeneous racial representation. We, for example, as Garifuna legacy, we have a legacy that comprises transnationalism, ancestral continuity, collective sense of identity. As a transnational community, migration, right, has it has played a significant role in the Garifuna people's need to establish international communities. Because of the racial tensions resulted from complexities in understanding Blackness in the Central American region, amplified by global neoliberalist and exclusionary practices, the Garifuna who have eagerly sought opportunities in the United States, migrating for survival, developed as a counter-hegemonic consciousness in the wake of disenfranchisement in the region. Our ancestral continuity, right, is the Garifuna language, as well as the dances, the songs, and the culinary art, which are linked to a complex Afro-Indigenous ancestral legacy that has been cherished and maintained for over 2 centuries. As a transnational community in the United States, the Garifuna have focused on instilling ethnic pride among Garifuna youth by teaching them the Garifuna history, language, traditional songs, dances, and drumming. The Garifuna people have demonstrated the continuity by upholding authentic sense of community and preserving the indigenous language and cultural traditions, thereby resisting normative ways of knowing. Our collective sense of identity is through songs. Garifuna have communicated a sense of shared emotional connection. After experiencing decimation and genocide on the island of St. Vincent, discrimination and marginalization under colonial regimes, they have constantly needed to counter social, economic, and historical exclusions. Garifuna people can be identified by their Garifuna language, a collective knowledge system that includes the stories of our elders, communal accountability, and the conglomerate of embodied ways of knowing. Finally, Hispanic Heritage Month, with a limited understanding of the heterogeneity among Spanish-speaking folks, obstructs the opportunity for the creation of stronger Black and Brown coalitions in the United States. We must focus on building coalitions, just as our ancestors have done during the civil rights movement and the African American Indian in Latin America during colonization. It was through these solidarities that the Garifuna from Central America inherited a legacy of African and Amerindian ways of knowing that constitutes our cultural identity today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mena, for your wonderful presentation, which invokes so many questions in my mind, because there was a question about identity and who represents what. And unfortunately, because we are living in a complicated, dynamic times, I did reach out to many different scholars. And let me tell you honestly, it was a task at hand because I had no money to do this webinar in the beginning. And out of 500 scholars I reached out to, only 3 replied. So I apologize to the listeners if that sounds very like boasting myself. It's not that. It takes a lot of work. It takes whole village to get things done. So having said that, now I will introduce our next speaker. And let me just, there you go. And Dr. Antonia Mardones Marshall will speak next. And she's a political anthropologist and sociologist whose work explores the intersections of international migration, race and ethnicity, national identities, and the state with a focus on Latin America. Her research contributes to scholarship on ethno-racial classification, political mobilization, social integration, and legal reforms. She received her PhD from our own UC Berkeley in sociology in 2024, and is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Education at the University of Tarapacá, and a principal investigator at Migra Millennium Nucleus, Perceptions of and Consequences of Immigration. So please join us in welcoming Dr. Antonia Mardones Marshall.
Hi, do you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Yes, and is the presentation, can you see it well?
Yep. Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Liladar, so much for the invitation and for the kind introduction. And also I want to thank Janaina and Noria for their fascinating presentations. As Liladar mentioned before, well, I'm a Berkeley graduate. I'm currently based in northern Chile, in the city of Arica, just half an hour from the border with Peru. I serve as an assistant professor at the Universidad de Tarapacá. This is a university with 48% of students that are indigenous and 8% that are immigrants. And Arica is also the place where the Afro-Chilean movement emerged here in Chile more than 20 years ago. So questions of representation are especially significant for us here. Today, I will share part of my sociology dissertation research completed last year. The project compares the legal recognition of Afro-descendants in Argentina and Chile, analyzing how different actors negotiate the meanings of Afro-descent that become institutionalized in laws and public policies. So to start, why Argentina and Chile? Most research on race in Latin America has focused on countries with large and visible Black populations, such as Brazil, Colombia, some Caribbean countries, and the Southern Cone, by contrast, has been largely overlooked. There are no comparative studies of Argentina and Chile to my acknowledgement. And from a US perspective, Latin America is often treated as a single case. People assume race in Latin American countries is more fluid, with multiple intermediate categories, or that pigmentocracies work the same across the region. But Argentina and Chile stand out. Unlike many other countries in the region, they never fully embraced the ideology of mestizaje or racial intermixing, and instead both countries built national identities tied to whiteness, erasing the historical but also the contemporary present of Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples. It was only in the 1990s in Argentina and the early 2000s in Chile that Afro-descendant activists began to organize. And because these movements are relatively recent, we can observe almost in real time how activists and states negotiate what Blackness means in each setting, a comparative advantage for conducting research. So here's the puzzle that is driving my research. Despite such similarities, each country institutionalized Afro-descent quite differently in response to activist claims. My first contact with Afro-Chilean communities was in 2010, but it wasn't until 2016 that I did for the first time fieldwork in Arica, the birthplace of the Afro-Chilean movement. And there I interviewed activists and leaders from different organizations, and to my surprise, accounts like the one in the slide came up often. I'm gonna read it. It says, my mom, who came from a very Black family, never spoke of slavery. It was something shameful, a topic that shouldn't be discussed with the children so they wouldn't feel stigmatized. My mom never spoke to us about Blackness. I figured it out by myself and would be content saying that her color came from my Peruvian grandfather. That's as far as I traced it, not to Africa. What struck me the most was that many people active in the Afro-descendant movement, not all, but a significant group, had only recently discovered their African ancestry. 5 years later, when I did fieldwork in Arica, when I did fieldwork in Argentina, I found similar stories. This reflects a broader regional trend. As multiculturalism gained ground internationally and Black movements grew across Latin America, many people in Argentina and Chile began identifying as Afro-descendants for the first time. In both countries, however, claiming an Afro-descendant identity also raises questions of authenticity, whether one is really Black or Afro-descendant, and that creates pressure to ethnify, to make identity visible, which has included the reconstructions and some things even in the invention of new traditions to legitimize belonging. So a few years after this first round of fieldwork in 2019, Chile passed a law recognizing the Chilean Afro-descendant tribal people. The law defines the group narrowly as the descendants of those brought to Chile through the transatlantic slave trade up to the 19th century, and ties recognition to a long-standing history, culture, and identity linked to the national territory. By contrast, Argentina had already passed a law in 2013 establishing November 8th as the Day of Afro-Argentines and Afro-Culture, and that law is framed in much broader terms, emphasizing ancestry and culture more generally, and making visible Afro-descendants' history and cultural expressions. So it's this divergence, how each country defines and institutionalizes Afro-descent, that lies at the core of my research. The research is based on a multi-sided ethnography conducted between 2020 and 2023. In Chile, I worked in Arica, where the Afro-Chilean movement emerged, and in Santiago, where state institutions are mostly located, governmental offices. You can see there in the map, the upper red circle is Arica, close to Peru, and the lower one is Santiago. And in Argentina, I focused on Buenos Aires, where both activism and state institutions are concentrated. So across these sites, I conducted 105 in-depth interviews with activists, state officials, international actors, and other actors such as scholars, NGOs officials, and others. I did participant observation in both community and institutional settings, and I analyzed archival and policy documents for historical and legal context. I approach race and therefore also Afro-descent as a process in permanent construction and as a field of political struggle, thinking in Pierre Bourdieus terms. So this helps explain why definitions of who is Afro-descendant vary across countries, given that who is considered Afro-descendant depends on history and context. From the top down, states construct and institutionalize racial categories, often reflecting political priorities, but from the bottom up, race also takes shape in everyday interactions as people interpret phenotypical and cultural differences, and in doing so, they create and reproduce symbolic and social boundaries. So my research brings these two perspectives together, showing how Afro-descent is shaped both by state actions and by daily practices. Before turning to my results, I want to briefly note how the racialization of territory has been central in both Argentina and Chile. As in other Latin American countries, after independence, centers of power were built as white spaces, pushing Blackness to the margins. In Argentina, this is clear in Buenos Aires. Before independence, around a third of the city's population was Afro-descendant. And today, most Afro-Argentine activism is still based there. Yet, Buenos Aires has long been imagined as a European white city, sustained by erasing Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples from national narratives and framing Blackness as foreign. From the late 19th century, state-led modernization displaced Black families from central neighborhoods to the suburbs and beyond, producing racially segregated poor areas, as shown in the map from Geller and her colleagues' work. And later waves of rural migrants arriving from the mid-20th century, pejoratively labeled as cabecitas negras by people in Buenos Aires, extended this stigma, reinforcing Buenos Aires' image of whiteness. Chile also has clear historical evidence of Black presence across its territory, but the Afro-Chilean movement has concentrated in the northern region of Arica and Parinacota, where Arica is the capital city. This region was annexed officially only in 1929 as the result of the War of the Pacific between Chile on the one side and Peru and Bolivia on the other. And following the annexation, Chilenization campaigns in the region targeted Peruvian and Bolivian residents, and Afro-descendants often had to hide their identities to avoid violence. Yet, colonial records show that in 1813, over 60% of Arica's population was Black, but also in central Chile, more than 10% of the population was of African descent by the end of the 18th century. However, Chile's national narrative has long insisted Afro-descendants disappeared, sustaining the myth of Chilean racial homogeneity. From the center of the country, this region, Arica and Parinacota, is seen as the geographic and symbolic margins of the nation, reinforcing the idea of Blackness as foreign. And today, Arica's Afro-Chilean movement is often dismissed as non-Chilean, with Blackness framed as Peruvian in this region. So in both cases, in Argentina and Chile, we see how geography and race intersect to marginalize Blackness. And the findings I will present now center Afro-descendant voices, analyzing how they respond and build strategies of belonging and recognition from within these geographically marked positions. So Afro-descendant activists define Blackness differently depending on context and audience. But in both Argentina and Chile, culture is a central way they affirm their identity. Through cultural heritage, they revitalize identity, they assert authenticity, and gain visibility. Still, activists in each country frame belonging through culture in distinct ways. In Argentina, activists highlight their historical contributions like tango or key historical figures in the making of Argentinidad, to claim that national identity is shaped by Afro-descendant heritage. They demand inclusion in the national imaginary and reparations through affirmative action and changing curricula, challenging a country that still imagines itself as white. For example, one Afro-Argentine activist told me the following: "Nobody discusses the significant contributions of Afro-Argentines, not only to the nation building, but also to Argentina's cultural identity. Everyone celebrates tango, folklore, malambo, everybody eats Argentina empanadas and pastelitos, yet these are Black legacies, and nobody knows they are Black legacies." In Chile, Afro-Chileans root identity in Arica's regional history and practices, some shared with other groups in the region, others distinct, like the Tumbe Carnaval, a dance recovered and reconstructed through the movement itself. And this strategy legitimizes them as an ethnic group with a distinct culture to be protected. Unlike in Argentina, the focus here is not on national belonging, but on local legitimacy in a state that often sees them as outsiders. As one Afro-Chilean activist told me, recognizing our dance as cultural heritage acknowledges our significant contributions to culture. Before the Republic was formed, Morenos de Paso dances, tied to families in Arica and Tacna, existed. This recognition reinforces our pre-existing presence and strong cultural influence regionally, reaffirming our territorial identity. So despite differences, both use culture as a strategy of resistance and visibility. Yet these narratives also risk, and this is one of my main arguments, these narratives risk reproducing the very exclusions they seek to challenge. In Argentina, the focus on historical contributions can confine Blackness to the past, while reinforcing a Buenos Aires-centered vision of nationhood that excluded other cultural expressions of Blackness in other regions of the country. In Chile, linking identity to Arica risks marginalizing Blackness as regional and limiting claims to cultural recognition. For this reason, activists in both countries are building alternative narratives, forming alliances and expanding geographically to overcome these risks. I will talk now about these alternative narratives. So in both Argentina and Chile, Afro-descendants build identity in relation to other marginalized groups with whom they share spaces and experiences of discrimination. In Buenos Aires, many Afro-Argentines come from indigenous, feminist, or LGBTQI+ movements, and today they frame anti-racist demands in intersectional terms, linking Blackness to other forms of exclusion. This not only strengthens the struggle for reparative justice, but also underscores that racial discrimination is not just a thing of the past. It's a pressing issue in the present. The following quote from an Afro-Argentine leader illustrates this clearly. He says, "We consistently engage with indigenous and sexual diversity movements. We have learned a lot from oppression and of the construction of a political subject that can influence public policies." In Arica, Afro-Chileans live alongside indigenous communities, especially Aymara communities. Despite some tensions among them, they've drawn inspiration from indigenous struggles to shape their own claims. This links identity, territory, and tradition, providing a basis for demands that go beyond symbolic recognition, such as territorial rights. This echoes a broader Latin American pattern, where Afro-descendants often must present themselves as culturally distinct to secure collective rights, similarly to indigenous groups who are generally regarded in Latin America as the model multicultural subject. As one Afro-Chilean activist and musician told me, I researched Tumbe carnival music, which shares parallels with indigenous traditions as a carnival rhythm tied to celebration of rain, crops, and seasonal renewal. Before Afro-descendants were recognized as a people or developed a consciousness of Afro-descent, their practices already reflected distinct cultural communities with a shared tradition, language, and history. Finally, in both Argentina and Chile, activists have realized the limits of concentrating the movement in a single region. For this reason, they are now working to expand into other parts of the country. This shift begins with recognizing not only that slavery existed across the national territory, but that Afro-descendant communities exist today beyond the traditional centers of activism. In Argentina, activists from Buenos Aires traveled to the provinces in 2010 to identify new Afro-Argentine leaders, especially in preparation for the first national census that included an Afro-descendant identification question. One of those activists told me, "We told the authorities, look, we want to visit the northern provinces where there was no information about Afro-descendants beyond historical records showing 30% Black population in one place, 40% in another, yet no Afro-Argentine organizations existed there. We visited 10 provinces, met with provincial statistic department officials, held press conference, appeared on TV. It was a very artisanal activist effort and sparked a decade-long mobilization process." In Chile, the movement remains centered in Arica, but activists increasingly reflect on the limits of this territorial framing. The focus on Afro-Arican culture has helped gain visibility and state recognition, but also risks folklorization, overshadowing broader political demands like fighting racial discrimination and inequality. In response, some Afro-Chilean activists are expanding the movement to other regions of the country, fostering identity reconstruction outside of Arica. One Afro-Chilean activist from Arica, but now based in Santiago, told me, "I believe Afro-descendant history is often framed as solely from Arica, which foreignizes the movement due to Arica's border proximity and later annexation to Chile. It's different claiming a long-standing Afro-descendant presence in Santiago or in Valparaiso than in Arica, where people often say, but they're Peruvian or they're Bolivians. Those are the things you usually hear. So this geographic expansion has become a key strategy for building a more national, diverse, and transformative movement. This table summarizes my argument, the forms of spatial racialization constructed from above in both countries, how activists contest these narratives from below, the risks of certain identity framings that can reproduce exclusion, and the alternative frameworks activists are building for their political demands. So in both countries, early strategies helped gain visibility, but also had limits like factorization, excessive centralization, or confining Blackness to the past. Activists are now pushing new approaches. In Argentina, through intersectional alliances and decentralizing the movement. In Chile, through collective rights and expanding beyond Arica. To close, I want to emphasize that Afro-descent is not a fixed identity, but something constantly constructed and contested. The diversity of Afro-descendant subjects reflect these different histories and contexts. Movement leaders play a key role in defining who is recognized as Afro-descendant, and this always depends on context, on power relations, and who they are engaging with at a given moment. And these framings have very concrete effects. They shape which rights are claimed, how the state responds, and who is included or excluded from public policies. In other words, the institutionalization of the Afro-descendant category is not just symbolic, but it has real impacts on people's lives. And more broadly, recognition itself is always political. I'll end with this. As we witness today the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people, we are reminded that recognition, such as the recognition of the state of Palestine, is not a symbolic gesture, but a matter of survival, rights, and justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Antonia Mardones Marshall, for your presentation. Before we open the floor for the question and answer, I forgot one key important moment, is to be grateful to the sponsors of this event. And the sponsors are Social Sciences Division, in which I sit, UC Berkeley Library, of course, Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies on campus. They provided modest honorarium. So I'm grateful to Natalia and Julia, Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And one more very critical component of this event has been Staff Development Committee. They stood by me when people stopped believing in me. Do you really want to do this in this atmosphere of all this funny business going on? Do you still want to do it? I said, yes, we need to speak, we need to recognize, and we need to show how nuanced identities are. So I want to thank them, especially Cody Hennessy, as well as Angelica, my colleague in social sciences, who created at the last minute this poster for me. So I'm much grateful. Having said that, now the time is for questions. We don't have a lot of time. And there is a comment, Andrew Mastas, not a question, but thank you everyone for sharing your work and perspectives and voices. Thank you so much, Andrew. We are grateful for you that you are here attending this webinar. So please feel free to ask questions. Also, Dr. Mariela Cotito, Ines Cotito, had some family emergency, so she couldn't attend. So she sends her regrets to all of us. Any other questions? Going once? No, because everybody's time is so important. Es que no quiero atrapar gente aquí. This is not my goal. My goal is to celebrate this. This was the 5th annual webinar, so I was very grateful that okay, Erika has a question. Erika, type your questions into question and answers, please. Erika, I know you have a question. Why don't you type your question into questions and answers? Thank you so much. Let me see. Erica, I will invite you to type your question into, yeah, thank you. How do you disseminate this knowledge to younger scholars in K-12? Dr. Nadia, Janaina, all of our colleagues, Dr. Marshall.
Yes, I can take that question. Thank you, Erica, for that question. And it is important for us to, number one, go to the root of this situation, right? For example, develop school curriculums, right? And share this information with school districts and help them understand the importance of the need for a more more cultural understanding around us, right? Hispanic Heritage Month, for example, has usually looked very homogeneous, as I said earlier, and we need to teach the nuance, right? All these different, the diverse identity of Latin Americans and Spanish-speaking peoples. And I think that through generating newer ways of designing curriculums and bringing this understanding of diverse cultures is one way in which we can help K to 12 students understand this information.
Janaina, please, by all means.
Thank you. It's a pretty good question, because here at UNLAB we're discussing about the importance, the crucial importance of extension projects. So right now we also have extension projects in local schools near UNLAB. So I'm not just talking about the university, I'm talking about schools, which is in one of the poorest regions of Brazil. So these are primarily basic education schools, and through these initiatives, my advisee and students, we are beginning to introduce students to the topic of climate change and also climate justice, which is completely linked with racial issues. So right now, our goal is to raise, how can I say, awareness early, and also connect the scientific knowledge to their everyday lives and encourage young people to think critically about environmental challenges in their own communities, especially because I'm talking about rural communities. My university is located not in a big city, which could be Fortaleza. My university is located in a rural region, which the name is Redenção. Was the first city in Brazil to abolish slavery. That's why my university was built there. So we are working really hard in extension programs, talking about racial topics, climate change, also because we have a law. We have to talk about the history of Afro and Afro people in Brazil. We have to talk about diaspora. So this is a law that we have to teach in basic public schools. I mean,
Thank you so much, Janaina.
That's why we're trying to spread.
Okay, so we have 2 more questions and 2 minutes. Fast track, how are the movements described interacting with the United Nations second decade of African descent? I don't know the answer to questions. Any of you know? Okay.
I can say something about that. Not particularly about the second decade, but it applies also, at least the case of Chile and Argentina. The consolidation of these movements that were relatively late in comparison to other Afro-descendant movements in the region, especially in Brazil or in Colombia. This kind of transnational networks that have formed around or have also pressured United Nations to create this international decade in the first place are very, very relevant. Actually, both movements in Argentina and Chile, their spike of their emergence was around the 2001 Durban Conference. If it wasn't for that, it was after the Durban Conference that some Chileans came back and said, let's create the first Afro-descendant NGO, because they were exchanging experience with activists in other countries and seeing ways in which it was possible to position claims and demands towards the state. So I think those phases are very important. And towards the second decade, I know that some leaders here and also here in Chile, and also in Argentina are participating in events around it. So they're still very, very active in those spaces.
Okay, thank you so much. And last looks like a comment, and after that we will end the webinar. From Jasmine, it says, from each, especially Dr. Mardones Marshall, I am reminded of Dr. Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists, who talks about the postnatal future of the United States of America. He named the potential adoption of Latin Americanness, that is erasing race for nationality, but the issues of deep-rooted pervasive inequities remain. We see this here in fast, forceful form, erasure of history to re-indoctrination of US residents and our single students in a single mythical narrative of United States, absent identities, from global majority, focusing on white and male and Western European origin, given that my earlier query about representation from a full panel of Afro-descendant peoples is critical. I recognize you, Jasmine. Maybe next time you can help me to find those panelists, and I'll be most grateful, because it's important for us to have representation. No taxation without representation, but this is what I could do, and I appreciate you speaking up. So I should not be here because I'm Indian and I'm doing Latin American studies, right? That's kind of, all American professors should not be teaching Latin America, mostly white people, right? So we are not going to go that route. I wish everybody all the best. Thank you for attending this webinar. And I thank Dr. Antonia Mardones Marshall, Dr. Nodia Simena, and Dr. Janaina Campos Lobos for presenting their critical viewpoints and asking us to think more critically about how Latin Americanness is Hispanic American webinar. What does it mean to be Hispanic American, and how nuanced and diverse these identities are? And I wish all of you all the best and resilience. Thank you so much. Be well, stay healthy. I'm ending this webinar now. Take care. Bye-bye.